This being Trinity Sunday, I must confess that this was all an elaborate ruse to get you non-Trinitarians into worship so that you could hear a good sermon on the doctrine of the Trinity. This is the second year in a row John Lew has been here for Trinity Sunday. We had a Unitarian preach our Trinity Sunday sermon last year, so we think it must be now a tradition. She'll have to be back every year on this day. Well, in our group of clergy colleagues, particularly the Wednesday morning group, I've actually been considered one of the more orthodox ones. Not as orthodox as Matt Meinke, our Presbyterian, but more so than most in the group who like to revel in their heresies. Now, what I contend has differentiated me and Meinke is that my orthodoxy is more metaphorical, which of course allows me to be wishy-washy when I want to be. So for instance, on my very first sermon here, as a candidate for your pastorate, it was the second Sunday of Easter. The text was the Doubting Thomas story, and I preached on the resurrection. When I finished preaching, I sat down, and Mike Piazza leaned over to me. He was at the time the dean and national pastor of the Cathedral of Hope in Dallas. He leaned over and he said he had never heard a sermon quite like that, in which someone who believes in a historical resurrection heard what they wanted to hear, and someone who believes in a metaphorical resurrection heard what they wanted to hear. And I simply told him, thank you. It seemed wise on a candidate sermon. It's not that I don't have deep convictions and views on these topics. The problem is that I have views in the plural on these topics. They shift, and one day go one way and another day a different direction. And even at the same time, I hold positions which don't necessarily fit together. It's why I probably revel a lot in mystery and care nothing for certainty. I've never really, though, had a problem with the Trinity. The first non-Trinitarians I met were Pentecostal Holiness, my best friend in 6th grade and his pastor father. They rejected the Trinity as a doctrine that was non-biblical, resting on the creeds of the church. Well, I didn't care much for the creeds either, but though I knew what they were rejecting, I was never really clear about what they believed, as they clearly believed in the divinity of the Creator, of Jesus and the Holy Spirit. Well, to me, the early Christians were simply trying to make sense of their experience. They had encountered divinity in a myriad ways and wanted to somehow find a way to make it fit all together. And I think that was a noble enterprise, even if the resulting creeds are filled with tortured words and based upon an Aristotelian physics that no one currently believes. In college, I toyed with the idea for a while of restructuring the doctrines of the church around quantum mechanics. Dr. Wester might remember that idea, but I wasn't smart enough to complete that project. Well, though I've never had much problem with the Trinity, I have also always been at least a little heretical on the Trinity, at least since college. In the Southern Baptist hymnal, the very first hymn is Holy, 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 a Trinitarian hymn. The final line of both the first and the last stanzas is God in three persons, blessed Trinity. Well, since college, and probably since Dr. Wester's philosophy classes, I have been skeptical of this idea of three persons in one. So I have always sung the line, God in three persona, blessed Trinity. Working real hard to fit 3 syllables into 2 beats. And I've always sung that line a little softer than my normal gusto at singing hymns, just to not offend the sensibilities of those around me. The truth is, despite being an academically trained and PhD certified metaphysician, it isn't the metaphysics of the Trinity that interests me at all. In fact, that really bores me. What does interest me is the politics, the ethics, the economics of the Trinity. To me, the foundational confession of the doctrine of the church is that divinity is a relationship of becoming, of what my favorite theologian James McClendon calls an ecstatic fellowship. The goodness and love and power and glory flow forth from one another until they overflow, and that goodness and love and power and glory spill out onto all of creation. inviting all of it to participate in this divine dance. All creation is touched with divinity and invited into a deep, ongoing relationship with one another. So ultimately, God's dream for creation is that it participate in what God experiences, ecstatic fellowship. So for me, the doctrine of the Trinity is more an invitation into a way of living. It's an ongoing adventure into novelty, calling us forth into relationship and community. In 2005, shortly after I received the call to become your pastor, I pulled down off of my shelf the collected works of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which is a pretty hefty volume. I'd had it for about a year, I just hadn't gotten around to reading it yet. But I knew I'd better start, because in the process of calling me, Mike Piazza and Joe Hudson had conveyed to me again and again that accepting the role of pastor of this congregation was more than being a pastorate. It was to take a role as a leader in the civil rights struggle, and that I needed to prepare for press conferences and rallies and protests and all the things that come with the civil rights movement. Well, if that was the job, then I needed to sit at the feet of one of the masters, and so I began to diligently read Dr. King's works, and there, of course, found exactly what I was looking for: the philosophical, theological, and pastoral understanding for what lay ahead. And I have returned often to these words for strategy, for advice, for comfort, for inspiration. Dr. King envisioned a beloved community. To achieve that, we must demonstrate love even to our enemies, something I know which I've been a little famous for at times. Our means and methods must be as noble as our ends. In tonight's first reading, we glimpse his understanding that building this community is to work with the whole of creation toward its aim and its purpose, and to work against this community, or to not be involved actively in creating it and embodying it, is to work against creation. So listen again to these words. All life is interrelated. All humanity is involved in a single process. And all humanity is brothers and sisters. There is a creative force in this universe that works to bring the disconnected aspects of reality into a harmonious whole. I believe that harmonious whole to be the ecstatic fellowship. I believe that these powerfully eloquent paragraphs from Dr. King actually end up saying far more about Trinity than anything in the ancient creeds of the church. The last 5 years, I have understood my work here in the church and through the church, in service and mission to the larger community, to be an ongoing effort of building a beloved community. And for me, it has not simply been about a civil equality or about making this an independent, self-supporting congregation. Our work together has been to create a better, more just, more peaceful world. Because in doing so, that draws us closer to the ecstatic fellowship with one another, awakening the divine in each of us. And so may the journey ahead be filled with adventure as you continue this holy work.